Good morning. Thanks for coming to CSIS. My name is Jim Lewis. I work here. We have a really good panel today. We appreciate everyone coming out. I think it will be a lively discussion. Let me introduce the panelists to you. We will have their biographies on our website, but we'll start with Ambassador Valentin Zellweger from the Swiss Foreign Ministry. You're a career diplomat?
Yes.
Yeah, he's a career diplomat who has worked at the UN, helped establish the ICC, and now is the chef de cabinet for the first president of the ICC.
Was. I was chef de cabinet.
Oh, that's what I said, yeah. Okay, good.
Yeah. So
we're in agreement, encouraging, and is currently the head of the Directorate of Public International Law and the legal advisor to the Swiss Foreign Ministry. Next to him is Catherine Lotrianti, who is, of course, a professor at Georgetown's and the director of the Institute for Law, Science, and Global Security. Catherine has done a tremendous amount of work, and she was the advisor to Brent Scowcroft on the PIFIAB, which now has a different name, but it was the PIFIAB when she was on it, and was in the office of the general counsel at the CIA at the start of her career, and is currently involved in so many international discussions, I won't even list them. Colonel Gary Brown, there to the left of the ambassador, is currently a professor at the Professor of Cybersecurity at the Marine Corps University in Quantico, so thanks for driving up, Gary. Prior to that, he was in the ICRC here in their Washington office, and he has been in the Judge Advocates Corps. I thought you were at Cyber Command too.
I was.
Yeah, at Cyber Command and in other military commands. So very experienced in this. And finally, David Simon, who was one of the unnamed lawyers, I think, in the New York Times article yesterday. A special, he's looking down, I shouldn't have said that. Former special counsel to DOD, the General Counsel's office for a long time, and currently is doing a lot with CFIUS and other security-related issues, and one of the real experts that we call on here in Washington. So I don't think we'll do very much. What we'll do for the format here is we'll ask the ambassador to make some opening remarks. After he speaks, I'll ask each of the three panelists to comment, throw in their own views, and then we'll have a little bit of interaction and we'll throw it open for questions. So with that, why don't we get started? All set?
Yep, thank you very much. Thank you very much for organizing this event and for giving us this opportunity to discuss the challenges of new technologies. And I would just like, as you said, I'm the legal advisor of the Swiss Foreign Ministry, and I would just like to give my angle or the perspective on this issue. Why are we interested? Because Switzerland is, as you probably imagine, not a superpower, neither in terms of cyberspace nor in terms of the development of laws. And by the way, we are not really known for engaging actively in warfare. So what is our interest? And the interest is very specific. Switzerland, as you know, was always promoting humanitarian law, the laws of war. And our aim is to keep them applicable also to new threats. And over time, we have encountered, all of us have encountered many new challenges to the application of international humanitarian law, new technologies, new methods of warfare. And the matter always is, can you use existing rules or do you have to adapt them? And that would be my take on it. And if you have to adapt them, how best would you do that? And that's the work of mostly of diplomats, because that's where you get into the rule setting business. And if you look back, the first international humanitarian law convention was the one in 1864. And since then, we have known a total revolution of warfare. And the issue of new technologies came up very quickly. If you look at for example, the Lieber Code, it outlaws the use of poison. So they already dealt with weapon systems that were, in their view, in Lieber's view, not compatible with the tenets of international humanitarian law. So if you look at further development, you have the dum-dum bullets, and all new weapon systems at one stage had to be dealt with. And in fact, there are two basic ways you can deal with them. Either you outlaw them or you try to see how you can apply the existing law on them. And to my knowledge, the only system that was outlawed in a preventive manner was blinding laser weapons. Before they were ever used, where they were outlawed. But you had, for example, you have air warfare. If you look at the treaty basis, you won't find much about air warfare. So it was possible over time to clarify the principle applicable to air warfare, which today is probably one, and I see you're much more expert than I am, is probably the main, activity in warfare. If you look at the law, you won't find much, and still it could be regulated. So if we now go to the the challenges that are the subject of this discussion here, cyber and lethal autonomous weapon systems, the first question would be, can you deal with them under existing law? And can you apply the existing law? Now, on cyber, there was this UN group of governmental experts that issues 2 reports which say that basically international law, and in particular the UN Charter, is applicable also to cyberspace. The interesting thing, in our view, about these 2 reports, which are the most authoritative document in the international arena for the time being, is that they cut out the applicability of international humanitarian law. So that is something that still needs to be debated. Likewise, on laws, the lethal autonomous weapon systems, there were discussions within the CCW system, the conventional weapons discussions in Geneva, and there seemed to be, although there is still not a commonly agreed definition of laws, there is a basic consensus that, in fact, the law as we know it is applicable. Now, this being said, that does not solve all the problems. And that is where we come to the need for clarifications. And that is something that in the past has always been done when you are coping or facing a new phenomenon. How do you apply the law, which in principle is applicable, but how can you really make it operational for the different questions? And we all know that in cyberspace there are specific questions that will have to be dealt with that are very difficult to solve. If you just look at a few of them, how do you define use of force in cyberspace? How do you distinguish between military and civilian objects? All these questions, there are many questions. What is an armed attack in cyberspace? And at one stage, there will probably have to be some kind of a consensus. And the question is, how can we achieve a commonly agreed consensus? Because as long as there is no international consensus, each and every country will apply the rules they deem to be applicable. Likewise, for the lethal autonomous weapon systems, what degree of human control is necessary? For example, is one of the main questions. Or the whole issue of responsibility. How can you, in the end, ensure either state or individual responsibility if you have robots that are just running around and making war? Is it, for example, possible to program robots to include in their programs very subtle value judgments, like, for example, proportionality? How can you program that into a robot? And these matters will have to be solved at one stage, although, as I mentioned, there is a consensus. In principle, we can apply the law, but we still have to know much more how we do that. And that is where my interest comes in as a diplomat. How can you achieve this kind of consensus? How can you make sure that all have the same approach to these questions? And of course, the easiest answer would be, well, just codify. Just negotiate a new convention, and then you have it. Now, that on some issues may be a good approach, and it has been in the past used on weapon systems, mainly also to outlaw weapon systems, landmines or cluster munitions, or this kind of stuff. But to negotiate a convention takes a long time, and then you have to wait until all the states ratify them. And again, that will take decades in many cases. So it's not a very efficient way to deal with it. In the past few years, there was, because codifications are so heavy, states increasingly resorted to what you could call in law, soft law mechanisms. I mentioned these two, the groups, the governmental expert group at the UN, but also the CCW group, the expert group that looked into these issues. There were other attempts to cope with new phenomena, and probably one that is most famous here is the phenomenon of private military and security companies that came up big time with the Iraq War, and there were all these questions: how do you apply existing international humanitarian law to private military and security companies? And there was a process that was initiated in Montreux in Switzerland that assembled all the interested states, those who contract private military and security companies, the territorial states, and also host states, and tried to come up with clarifications of the existing law to try to understand what really is applicable to private military and security companies. And although there were many apprehensions at the beginning that it will not be possible to find a consensus between, for example, the territorial and the contracting states, because it was felt that the divergences of views were too big. In the end, it was possible to agree on a document. The document was then submitted also to the United Nations, and today there are about 53 states that have signed it, among them the United States, which were a very active part of the whole process. You have the United Nations that apply also, that stick to the document, and you have NATO that has formally signed it. So that would be one approach to regulate in case it was possible to clarify and to find a consensus on these issues. Another possibility could be to, if you look at the past, there were different processes. I mentioned the Montreux process. There was a Tallinn process on cyber space. There was on other issues, there were different processes. And one of the weaknesses of these processes that are often they are not regionally representative. If you look, for example, at the Tallinn process, just to take one on cyber, which we are discussing here, the countries involved in Tallinn were mainly from the Western world. Now, if you wish to get, in the end, universal rules that are respected by everybody, you have to try to give ownership also to other regions. And we are now in the process of trying to create a new regular meeting of states of the Geneva Conventions dealing with international humanitarian law matters, which would, for the first time, create a dedicated forum to discuss these matters. And one possibility may be to then have the discussions within a forum that would centralize, so to speak, and would ensure that you have all the different, you would have the 197 state parties of the Geneva Conventions assembled in one room. And it would provide with a forum that would allow for furthering a common understanding of these new challenges. And it could be imaginable, for example, to have discussions either on laws, how to apply IHL rules on law to specifically deal with some of the issues that I highlighted, or also on cyberspace. That would be a possibility, but we would for the first time have a forum that is really dedicated to these issues. It would not be a UN ad hoc mechanism created to deal with them, but we could really focus on these questions. And that is where the diplomats come in, because we then try, on the basis of what the experts come up with indications how we could deal with matters, we would then have to try to channel them into political processes to make sure that international humanitarian law continues to be meaningful and be applied also with these new technologies. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Let me make a couple prefatory remarks and we'll go down the row. I suppose I should open by saying I think I'm the only person on the panel who isn't a lawyer. So I don't know if that's good or bad. But I was the rapporteur for the 3 successful UN group of government experts, and so wrote the language you're talking about. It's interesting, and I just want to flag a couple issues for the group. I wrote what I thought was a brilliant definition of use of force and armed attack. It was roundly rejected by all parties, who said, we prefer to keep this an area of national discretion, so it's a very difficult issue. In the preparations for the last round of talks, the chair and I independently concluded that international law would not be the sticky point, that norms would be the sticky point, and we were wrong, that the application of international law turned out to be the most difficult issue, and we did not get agreement on it until 5:40 on Friday night of the last day of the negotiations, which they end at 6, so it was a damn close run thing, right? The use of force, armed attack are crucial. It's not clear to me how you apply international law without defining these, but it's going to be very difficult. Some of the other things you might want to think about are, there's an interesting overlap, and the one that comes up a lot in the UN is the overlap with the application of international law to drones. And you know, I hesitate to bring that up, but the question for me is not so much robots, but you have new kinds of military activities, new technologies, new tactics, and it will take a while to get agreement on how law applies. There is consensus. I was surprised. You would think that the Russians and the Chinese, who we always pick on, would not be in favor of applying international law to these new forms of conflict. I don't think that's right. They don't have our views, but they are interested, and you'll notice that we managed to slip in some Geneva language into the report without saying it came from the Geneva Convention. It's a bit odd. I don't know why they're willing to put the language in on proportionality and discrimination, but we couldn't say it actually reflected international agreement. So a difficult issue when you think about how do you deal with new technology. One of the questions that maybe we can touch on, and this is related to Montreux, is both drones and cyber involve a high degree of clandestine activity. And it's this blurring of distinctions between clandestine and military that is one of the things that makes it difficult to reach common understandings. So this will be a project that we're working on here at CSIS for the rest of the year in cooperation with the UN on how do we rethink the application of international law in Geneva with UNIDIR. So with that, why don't I, with that sort of gloomy opening but from the trenches, it's very difficult to get agreement on these things. We thought it would be easy. Why don't I start with David and we'll just go down the row. Please keep your remarks relatively short if you could, but focus, and then we'll have an interactive discussion.
Thank you very much, Jim, and thank you to CSIS. A pleasure to be here. And I guess to be very brief, I thought I would identify in this context the application of the law of war to new technologies, some challenges, some difficult questions, and a couple principles that I think are informative and reflect some of the issues that I saw in my time 4 years in the Pentagon. In terms of challenges in this area with respect to the law of war, I think that actually the recently published DoD Law of War Manual, I think, points this out at the onset of the chapter on cyber operations, and it points out that this is an area of law that's not well settled, that it's going to take further development. And I think even though I think the United States government and a number of governments are quick to point out that the law of war doesn't need to change, that international humanitarian law doesn't need to evolve, there is always room for discussion and debate, and ultimately it's a matter of applying it to the specific circumstances. So that's one challenge, is sort of figuring out how we can establish its application. The second challenge I think that's worth pointing out in the context of cyber operations is the question about exactly what Jim was picking up on a moment ago, which is I'd sort of call the threshold question. Cyber operations below the threshold of the use of force. And this is an issue that is not really addressed in a meaningful way in the first Tallinn manual, but in the second one, what's referred to as Tallinn 2.0, this is sort of squarely addressed. But so if you look at, for example, the president's remarks about the Sony attack, look at the 2015 DoD cybersecurity or cyber strategy document that came out in April, does not refer to the Sony attack as one that would have reached those thresholds, either Article 51 or 2.4 in the UN Charter. So below the threshold, But in both cases, those documents, the President's remarks, do indicate that there was a violation of some sort of norm of state behavior. So also the OPM attack, the cyber attacks on health insurance companies, I think that it'd be fair to put these in the category of activities that fall below the threshold of use of force, certainly below 2.4. And so further legal work is needed to develop an effective international legal framework, including IHL law of war, for cyber operations. And I think that those are the same kinds of questions we have to address with respect to autonomy and autonomous capabilities. And then some difficult questions to flag. The ambassador flagged a number of them. But so what law applies at these various thresholds? There's a debate about countermeasures, retortions. These are tough questions. There's some complex distinctions. What's the difference between armed conflict and peacetime? You know, when is it not wartime? And these are basic questions that drive decisions that governments make about how they apply law. The distinction between combatants and civilians, particularly with respect to non-state actors. And then the questions about attribution, which are relevant not only to cyber operations, but also relevant to operations involving non-state actors. You look at the Ukraine, Yemen, Syria today. These are all very significant issues that have nothing to do with cybersecurity or cyber operations per se. And then a couple quick principles. One is sort of transparency and openness. The administration, the Obama administration, has been very clear in stressing this through a variety of speeches by senior lawyers in the administration. But I think the basic idea is that we have to make as much information about our legal frameworks public as possible, mindful of the fact that there are limits in terms of sources and methods and operational security considerations. But if you look at the President's archive speech going back to May of 2009, this was emphasized, and I think that it's something that's been a theme throughout the course of the administration. And the other thing I'd flag in terms of principles is just that through this kind of openness, you can really identify constraints, which are legal and policy in nature. And this is where the soft law comes in. The Tallinn 2.0 process, for example, which I'm involved in a limited way as a peer reviewer. It does involve, a number of other countries. So Russia and China are involved. NGOs are involved. They even have a law firm lawyer involved. It appears. But the role of the GGE, the role of the norms process that's underway, and the debate about what we make of the response of the U.S. government or other governments with respect to attacks like the Sony attack. And so the only other thing I'd point out is that there's policy transparency here too. And this in the autonomy context, if you look at the DoD Autonomy Directive, it's 3000.09. And throughout the document, it makes it very clear that the role of international law is going to be applied with respect to not only the design and the development, but the fielding, the testing, the employment of these capabilities. And I was one of the two lawyers that sort of was involved in helping fashion that autonomy directive. So I know that plays a significant role in thinking it through. But ultimately, the tough work is understanding what the technology would be intended to do, what are the intended effects, and how the law of war applies. So I think those are the two things that I'd mention in terms of principles, and just end with the notion that it's through identifying those constraints, legal and policy, that I think we empower our decision makers, and we're in a better position to cooperate and collaborate when a contingency does arise.
Let me just do a couple quick notes before we turn to Gary. There's language in the last GGE report that talks about you agree not to attack critical infrastructure in ways that aren't consistent with international law. The original phrasing was you agree not to attack critical infrastructure in peacetime. There were some nations that objected to the use of the word peacetime. This is negotiation. And so we put in consistent with international law to apply that you have not agreed not to attack critical infrastructure. You have agreed that you will only attack it in situations that aren't covered by the law of warfare. On David's point about Article 2.4, which is the renunciation of the use of force to settle international disputes, and Article 51, which is the inherent right of self-defense in the UN Charter, there's an inherent ambiguity, right? There's an intentional ambiguity, I think, between a commitment by states not to use force and a provision that allows them to use force. And this is one of the more powerful tensions you see. Finally, just quickly, We're in a different world, and so in any negotiation we do, and this is one of the problems I have with Talon, is I was just at the UN last week, and the issue that's come up is whatever rules we come up with will have to be rules that are acceptable and make sense to the non-aligned movement, the G77, to the countries that aren't participating in Talon. So this is a crucial change. Gary, please.
Thanks, Jim. Thanks for asking me. This is a really fun topic. I'm going to start, I don't always do this, but because there's a detachment of Marines here, I guess I should say I'm speaking in my personal capacity, not on behalf of anybody else. Even if I knew what they wanted me to say, I'm not saying it. This is autonomous weapon systems and cyber are perfect illustrations of how we need to apply, or we need to work to apply international humanitarian law, or what I will call LOAC, the Law of Armed Conflict, to new technologies, because they illustrate the two different ends of the spectrum, I think. There are a lot of projects going on now with autonomous weapon systems. I've been involved in a few of them, and we've worked really, really hard to come up with interesting legal issues that have to do with autonomous weapon systems. There aren't any, really. They're lawful. The current law of armed conflict covers them fine. Everything's good. Where we are now. If we look over the horizon, maybe 10 or 20 years down the road, where we start talking about artificial intelligence, where the system is able to select and engage targets lethally with very little or no guidance on the front end. In other words, not a set series of criteria that it applies to selecting targets. Now we're talking about artificial intelligence. That creates all kinds of interesting issues. That's really cyber, which is always interesting, of course. And not really autonomous weapon system, much more like cyber. But that's also like Skynet, and we already know Skynet's a bad idea, right? Because then you get the whole Terminator thing and all that going on.
Speak for yourself.
Yeah. But an artificial intelligence like that would likely decide that humans were the problem, and we would be in trouble. But that's a completely different issue over the horizon. I think where we are now, not really any issues. To some extent, autonomous weapon systems are in place now. They comply with the law. They're really, really good at applying long sets of criteria, which is where a lot of international lawyers want us to be anyway, with long checklists about how the law applies, and computers are really good at things like that. So from my perspective, not quite as big a challenge as some people would like us to believe. Cyber, on the other hand, completely unique. And as I think about how we take the law of armed conflict and try to get it to apply to cyber warfare, especially today on the 30th of October, I'm mindful of what it would be like if I took my son's Batman costume, Halloween costume, and I tried to get in it. I might be able to stretch the thing enough for me to fit inside it, and in the end I might look something like a husky Batman, but I wouldn't really look like what it was meant to look like when it got to the end. I mean, my son looks like Batman in it. I look like some other thing that's kind of similar to Batman. That's kind of like what LOAC looks like when we apply it to cyber, I think. And there are a few reasons for that, and I'll lay out three of them, although there are many interesting things we could talk about here, but in the interest of time, just three. Two of them have to do with the role of states in armed conflict. The first one is states in operations. One of the things that traditional LOAC was convinced of, or sort of premised on, was that states had a monopoly on violence. For the most part, when we talk about large-scale military involvement, it's going to be states that are involved in that, state on state. Of course, we had the rise of non-state groups, but usually a state on one side, and that system sort of started to break down on the kinetic side. It started broken on the cyber side, because most of the stuff that's going on in cyber, we think, or at least a lot of it has to do with non-state armed groups or individuals who are loosely affiliated with states. So creating all kinds of problems with the application of law, because you have groups that don't care about law, aren't interested in applying it. And so that's sort of on the operations side. On the law side, when we talk about the role of states, look, LOAC came out of the custom and practice of nations. Nations engaged in armed conflict. Some things worked, some things didn't, some things looked horrible, and everybody agreed they were horrible because they'd seen them in practice, and they became unlawful generally first because of the practice of states, and sometimes later were codified, like in the Geneva Conventions and the Hague Rules, but often, most of the time, began as state practice. So right now, as we look at cyber, and remember, customary law can only be made by the practice of states, not by the practice of individuals or non-state groups. So when we're talking about cyber operations, okay, let's go through and count all the operations that states have admitted to engaging in. Yeah, none, really, right? I mean, we have Stuxnet, we've got Saudi Aramco, we've got Rasgas, we've got Sony, and we have a lot of people pointing fingers at other people about who might have done which and who might have done what. But states aren't putting up their hand and saying, yeah, we did that, here's why we did it, and we think this ought to be the law. This is really an impediment to the development of law in the area, and it's truly slowed down. And Jim sort of referred to some of this too. States, I don't think they're ready to commit to what they want the law to be, and so they're not putting up their hand and saying, this is what we're doing and why we're doing it. We're at a very early stage here, and it's a big impediment to the development of the normal development of the law of armed conflict. It's difficult. And then finally, I'll talk about one more thing, and that is, and it's sort of playing on something we've talked about before, but looking at the application, the specific application of the law of armed conflict. So inside an armed conflict, most of the rules we have, in fact, pretty much all the rules we have were developed to deal with kinetic events. So kinetic events happen, things break, things are destroyed, people are injured, people are killed, all bad things. Cyber operations have the capability of making life difficult for civilians, of damaging national security without any of those kinetic effects. Sometimes cyber operations have the potential to have kinetic effects, but not all the time. They sometimes just have non-kinetic effects, and the law really isn't made to deal with those things. Yes, we can start saying, well, maybe we should talk about functionality or loss of functionality, which is one of the things we talk about in the Tallinn group. But I'm not convinced that that's a good idea, because remember, whatever rules we make for cyber, if we're changing the entire body of the law of armed conflict, also apply to kinetic warfare. And do we really want a rule, or would states really agree to a rule that if we limit the functionality of an object in kinetic warfare, that somehow it's been damaged and that counts as an attack, and all these rules apply? For instance, if you drive a military convoy across a bridge, the bridge has been denied, it's lost its functionality for a period of time. Is that really an attack? You're just using a bridge to drive things across it. So, and that's just one little example. There are all kinds of things that flow from trying to expand and stretch this body of law to fit.
It's interesting that you say that, because there does appear to me to be implicit agreement on a threshold for what qualifies as the use of force or an armed attack. And it's even explicit in some of the negotiations among states that if it has equivalent effect to a kinetic attack, if a cyber incident has equivalent effect, there's an implicit, almost explicit understanding at this point.
So
the difficult area is this gray area you've talked about non-kinetic, and I don't see it implicit.
It's tough too, Jim, and I think one of the things that sort of gets lost sometimes in translation is there's the discussion of the use of force armed attack threshold, but there's a separate threshold inside armed conflict for what constitutes an attack, for the application of the principle of proportionality, the principle of discrimination, and all that. So, and they're not necessarily the same thing, even though we use the same word.
Yeah, we got agreement on the latter and on the former, and that's where the point you raised about countermeasures, the law of countermeasures, is an important one. And it hasn't been discussed as much in the cyber context, but it was raised by one of the European delegations, and you will probably see it come back. So it's an important point to think about. Catherine, what we'll do is we'll have Catherine speak, then we'll ask the ambassador if he has any reaction, and then we'll go down the panel again and turn to you.
So, thank you. Thanks for coming actually today, and thanks for inviting me to speak. I love the opportunity to talk to, as my students know, just about anyone about international law. And I do tend to go on for a long time, but I've worked hard to keep my points limited. But it's something I'm very passionate about, and often, whether we're talking about cyber, or I'll actually begin with kind of describing a definitional approach of automated versus autonomous weapons, because we're really focusing on autonomous today. But I've been at many a policy meeting and discussions with state leaders, and I've often heard the expression that when a question comes up, does something rise to the level of a use of force? Does something rise to the level of an armed attack? I go off and start talking about international law and what principles we know, and examples and cases where the ICJ has given us some, although limited, insight. And typically what I hear back from policymakers is, well, Catherine, that's all nice and sweet, but it'll be decided by, and in the case of the United States, people saying it, The President of the United States will decide if something is a use of force. And that's a political decision and not a legal decision. And I always strongly object to that. And so I'm glad we're talking about that today because, yes, at the end of the day, it may be the president that authorizes the use of force, but that use of force may not be internationally accepted as legitimate, or that use of force may not be considered legal under international law because you're responding to something that was less than an armed attack under the Charter. So from my perspective as an international law professor, someone who's also practiced in the field, it is not just a political decision. Certainly the states are involved, but it is a legal decision, and we've learned from practice in the past that it's not one for one state to decide on its own whether something is legitimately a use of force. So this is exactly why this conversation is important and why it has to be international when you're trying to come to terms with something which is a challenge, and it is new technology and the development of it. What I find really interesting and unique, and it's both in cyber and in the autonomous weapons like robots that have yet not been fielded into warfare, but is generally accepted as coming, is that we have a unique opportunity. Now cyber, some of us were working on cyber for a long time, a couple of decades. Most people are recently introduced to the topic as we see some of these very visible intrusions and hacks. But truly in the autonomous weapons like robots, we do have an opportunity, because they haven't been fielded yet, to actually set out procedurally what would be acceptable, right? Because we have to think carefully, particularly about truly autonomous weapons, about how to develop these, because they're starting to be developed now. So here are some thoughts that I'll say about the law, but first, kind of laying it out. The debate on autonomous weapons is really one about whether these weapons are per se prohibited under the law, or that there's possible unlawful uses. And I think Gary said that made his position clear, and I agree with him, that there is nothing per se unlawful about these weapons. And that goes for cyber. Notice I won't talk about drones, because drones technically, I say to my students, I'm definitely type A on definitional terms, and I do make them understand that there's a difference between automated weapons and autonomous. Drones, as they are used and deployed now, are automated, right? Autonomous weapon, I mean, there's a human in the loop. There's somebody at a joystick, if you will. The autonomous weapons, though, that is kind of not here yet in terms of fielding them in the battlefield when you think of robots and artificial intelligence. So when we think about the debate, I do have to say this is one area I disagree with Human Rights Watch, which is sometimes that happens.
That's a good thing.
Well, all right, see, Louis and I disagree on things, we're friends, but we'll duke it out after the panel. They did come out with a report, and for those of you interested in the legality of autonomous weapons, I highly recommend you read it. It came out in 2012. The name of it was Losing Humanity, the Case Against Killer Robots. Their conclusion was that autonomous weapons per se were unlawful and unethical. I disagree with them on that. But the debate is that whether it's per se, and we have some weapons that international law and states have agreed to are per se unlawful, meaning you cannot use them. Right? I am in the camp, and Gary made it clear that it was his position, so I'll align myself, if you don't mind, that these weapons are not per se illegal, but it's about how we're going to regulate them in warfare. And that's what's going to take a lot of effort among experts, technical experts, policy experts, legal experts, and the result there may be, and I'll end with a few options. We may end up with an international instrument, like a treaty. We may not have to. On the treaty discussion, I will say that it has been my position on new issues, threats, or technology that's developed over the years. I've always been in the camp, and some have strongly disagreed, that we don't need a new international treaty to deal with these things. So it first came up after 9/11. I was on many panels where some people advocated we need a new Geneva Convention to deal with non-state actors, right? Terrorists. It's not in there. I said, don't need it. We can work with what we got. And by the way, Geneva Convention is applicable to non-state actors. That came up in cyber. Before cyber was popular to discuss publicly, many people said to me, Catherine, we need a new treaty. The Russians disagreed with me. They believe still that we need a new treaty. And I've still been of the position, it's not about creating a new treaty, but we have applicable law, we just need to know how it applies. That is the way the US is going on that. And then last, about autonomous weapons, I do believe the same. Now here's why don't I believe a new treaty is necessary or needed? One, you must be cautious when you start drafting a new treaty. You do not know what you may end up with, right? And while we might think we have a lot of foresight, you may be regulating yourself something that in a way that's unnecessary or actually bad. And then as already stated, it takes a long time to negotiate treaties, right? And we don't have that time. So in the meantime, what you should be doing is coming to agreement, states coming to agreement about what those rules of the road will be on these advanced weapons. So here are some of the legal principles that are important to think about. We've mentioned jus ad bellum. Gary mentioned jus ad bellum and jus in bello on this panel. Both areas of international law, although related, are very separate and need to be analyzed for autonomous weapons as to how they comply with these principles. Under cyber, we've already got agreement that the UN Charter applies, the jus ad bellum. Autonomous weapons, we don't have that yet, and that's where states need to be working on that. Now, in terms of cyber and autonomous, I'd say the best example we've seen in the cyber context is a Stuxnet. While no state has acknowledged attribution for it, experts have said it had to have been a state, at least a state. So we can talk about it in at least the hypothetical that a state has used a weapon that is autonomous in the sense, so you can have cyber weapons that are actually not just automated, but are truly autonomous. And that's why they're similar to the robots that are discussed as autonomous weapons. Here are the legal principles, though, for both cyber and autonomous weapons that need to be considered. And this is where I disagree with the Human Rights Watch, where I can kind of counter some of the things they say. There's three major principles in the LOAC, laws of war, which some of which have been mentioned. I'm going to emphasize them. You have to look at whether weapons are indiscriminate by their nature or not. I do not believe autonomous weapons, by their very nature, necessarily are indiscriminate. That would be an argument that would support human rights if I was wrong, the Human Rights Watch. Unnecessary suffering. If a weapon is developed where it causes unnecessary suffering, then it would be unlawful per se. And also the last principle on LOAC, harmful effects that are uncontrolled. You have to be able to, in warfare, to scale back, to reallocate, right, in order to control the harmful effects, particularly to protect civilians. This can be built into autonomous weapons, and therefore, my argument, not necessarily per se unlawful. On the targeting law, which Gary is very familiar with as a former JAG officer, you have to be able to develop and field a weapon that both discriminates and can make a distinction between civilians and military personnel or those involved in hostilities. Also, the weapon has to be able to operate and make decisions, or at least operate in a proportional manner. When I'm talking about autonomous, that has to be pre-programmed, and this is what needs work. And also, you have to have precautions in your attacks, meaning at times you have to have that weapon break off or alter the engagement. That needs to be built in any autonomous weapons, whether they're cyber or it's a robot. And also, you have to, the presence of civilians have to come into the contemplation in developing these weapons. So here's some quick options for autonomous weapons. Maybe you get an international instrument or a treaty.
Maybe we could come back to the options.
Okay.
And then, because I think that will be part of our ongoing discussion.
Okay.
And I thought this might be that was a good lead-in that I was going to seize to ask the ambassador if he has any reactions to what he's heard so far. Then I think one of the things we'll want to talk about is options. And you should be thinking of questions. I have at least three. So, Ambassador, did you have any?
Yeah. Thank you very much. I'd like to build up on something David said, the transparency that is applied in the United States. Listening to you, my impression is that there are probably not many countries in the world that have your level of knowledge about all these issues. And in the United States, it is transparent to a much larger degree than it is in other countries. The challenge we will have to face is how your knowledge, because you are at the forefront of the development of these technology in cyberspace, but also in laws, how can we make sure that the understandings about the applicable rules are shared by others? You mentioned that in the Tallinn 1 process, it was a rather restricted group, while Tallinn 2 then opened up. The fear I have is that highly advanced states that are highly advanced in technology will just move forward and lose, so to speak, the others. And the important thing is to find international mechanisms. What you have discussed are, to a large extent, internal discussions in the United States. You mentioned the law of war manual that was issued by the Pentagon. We will find to have ways to share your knowledge and also to share the readiness, I do think, that the United States have to have a lawful development, to find ways to apply the law to these developments. Because I'm not certain that this attitude is shared by others who may be as advanced in these issues as you are. And we know that other big powers are now slowly proposing new legal rules. One of them has even proposed a codification in cyberspace. And the issue is, how can we make sure that those who really have an interest in applying the existing laws, that as you mentioned, to these new technologies, how can we make sure that we have a very broad consensus among the different countries? And I think you mentioned it, that it's very important to have the non-aligned movement, to have the others, because in the end they will follow. If you look at, you mentioned the autonomous weapons that may be in the hands of a few at the beginning, in the end everybody will have them. So the rule setting will have to start now. You said for the time being we do not have problems, but the earlier we start with a broad based consensus mechanism to find common agreements or common understandings, I think the better it is. Last remark to Gary, your remarks on cyberspace, to say that it's like your Batman costume. In the end, if you think to the end what you say there is no regulation possible because attribution will not be possible, it's all clandestine, nobody will live up to, will say that this was his or her attack and all of that. In the end, we will have to find ways, and I would just like to give one example. You said that it's very difficult to distinguish between non-state actors and governments and how they interact. I know that, technically speaking, it's probably very difficult to see who does what, but wouldn't it be possible, because we also have rules in law that regulate the relationship between the governments and private actors? Wouldn't it be possible to try to develop these rules also to this new relationship in cyberspace? It may be too early to know how that will be done, but the basic principles of when a government will have to take responsibility for the actors it controls or it works with, we know them. So it's probably the challenge to find out how can we apply them to cyberspace.
Actually, that was going to be one of my questions, so maybe let me ask the question, and then if it's the right, this is a place where I'm not as strong, so I may not be asking the right stuff, but if it is. I will say that the lack of expertise on how cyber warfare is conducted or what the effect of a cyber weapon would be, a cyber attack would be, is a major impediment in negotiation. And so you have many nations who are deeply concerned but don't have a good understanding. And the public accounting of attacks is largely pathetic. So they read something in the paper and that makes it it's much more difficult than others. But the question I was going to ask gets back to this state responsibility issue. And the one that's come up repeatedly, although not with much clarity, and maybe we'll go down the row, Gary, is the ruling of the International Court of Justice on the Nicaragua case, yes, which is painful for me personally, but
for other reasons.
Yeah, and it comes up as a precedent in this area to exactly the point you were raising. So I don't know, can we go down Gary, do you want to start, and then we'll go to Catherine and then to David?
Yeah, I mean, I think just to respond to a couple things the ambassador said. I mean, first of all, I would say my comments didn't mean, by my comments, I didn't mean to imply there would never be any regulation here. All I'm saying is that I'm not sure that LOAC is the correct body of law. I think maybe if we stretch LOAC to the point where it covers cyber operations, the costume tears. Okay. And then it's no good for my son either, right? I mean, then nobody can wear it, because LOAC works because states agree on what the rules are, and if we stretch them to the point where nobody agrees, it's pointless. So we don't want to lose this body of law that's worked so well in kinetics because we're trying to stretch it to apply to cyber operations. And the one other direct point I'll make is that as far as states being responsible for sort of loosely affiliated civilians with them, my suggestion there is let's start with the clear situation we have, which is the little green men in Europe, that may be affiliated with some big power over there in Europe, and let's solve that problem. And once we solve that problem, cyber will follow. But until we can solve the problem in the kinetic world, which has much clearer rule set, then I think it's probably futile to try to solve it in the cyber realm. And there are lots of other issues as well with attribution, but lots of people talk about attribution, so I won't.
We'll go down the road.
So I can build on what Gary said. In terms of the applicability of LOAC and whether this will, in applying LOAC to new technology, whether it's the autonomous robots or it's cyber weapons, here's where we may disagree a little, but I get his point that you don't want to twist and turn the law so much that you undo its intent. However, I am of the position that the principles that underline the traditional treaties of LOAC, Geneva and Hague, can be applied in both the cyber weapons and even in the artificial intelligence as it's starting to be discussed in terms of how it would develop one day and be used. This is why I was happy in the UNGG report that came out in 2015, the most recent one. While there may have been disagreement about whether states felt comfortable invoking the phrase laws of armed conflict in that report, yes, I would have liked to see that explicitly, or Geneva and Hague. The important part for me, at least, was that they actually agreed in that report to the principles that are codified in customary international law, right, in LOAC. And I think you mentioned this at the beginning, Jim. They actually said that the principles of necessity, distinction, or discrimination, proportionality, and humanity apply. I think was it military necessity in there too? I'm not sure, but effectively, when I read it, that struck me as very telling, that they have at least 20 states, and the Security Council members, but importantly, some cyber powers like China and Russia and the US that have been in disagreement. They apparently all agreed to that. And I think that's important. While it doesn't say Geneva and Hague, it has, almost more importantly, the ICJ has told us in rendering decisions over the years that sometimes it is more important that the customary principles are applied, not necessarily that a treaty per se was honored. And that's in Jus in Bello and Jus in Bello. Now, on the state responsibility, another thing that I was happy to see in the UNGG report, both the 2013 one and the 2015, the principle of state responsibility was in that report. That goes to an important element when we have non-state actors that will continue to be engaged in military uses of force. How do you hold a state responsible for the actions of non-state actors? Well, in international law, this debate's been going on for years among professors, right, for a long time. And until 9/11, there was quite a lot of split. After the UN recognized through its resolution that terrorist organizations could actually carry out an armed attack, which triggered Article 51, which allowed the US and other states to use force against them in another state that we weren't at war with, it kind of, at least there are a few outliers still, colleagues that teach international law that I disagree with, but for the most part, people recognize that this debate is not that stark anymore, that you can actually attribute the activity of non-state actors to a state and then hold them accountable. Here's where the debate still lies, and people are still engaging in this. There's two thresholds, though. The Nicaragua case came up with a pretty high threshold, which is hard to prove, and that they came up with effective control. That's high, meaning what kind of evidence do you have to bring forth that shows that the state, using proxies, had effective control over those proxies that were acting? That effectively means, and has been interpreted from the Nicaragua case, that the state, you have to know and show that the state is directing specific operations. Well, they might not be doing that. We know in cyber, they're not doing that, right? And in other autonomous weapons, they might not be directing, but what if they're funding? Right? You've got a group that's willing to do your work and be your face. It's a proxy organization. Whether it's a company, it's an academic, it's students in a university. In cyber, we know that's being done. But the Tadich case, which I refer all you guys to read one day if you'd like, in that case, and Mike Schmidt disagrees with me on this, so we've had friendly disagreements, the court lowered the threshold. That's my position. Just to be clear, not all international lawyers agree with that. And they came up with a new threshold of overall control. And now this is key, I think, in cyber, and I've written some very probably boring and long law review articles that no one will ever read, but on this subject. Here's the challenge: due diligence. That is the legal threshold. You have to show that the state failed to do its due diligence internal to its territory to prevent these non-state actors, individuals, from harming others outside. It goes back to international law students, Corfu Channel case. So that has yet to be determined, and it's going to be determined on practice. But having geeky lawyers get together and talk about these thresholds, even with the Russians. Now on the manuals, I do have to say something that I learned last year.
Let me just put a footnote in, and then I don't want to cut you off, but Corfu and Nicaragua turned out to be very influential in any discussion of how to think about applying international law to cyber.
I'm glad someone thinks so, because I write about it, and usually when I start talking about these cases,
I say that because I had to go look them up when I'm sitting there listening to other countries talk about them. It's like, what the heck is Corfu?
It's very important for that principle. But on the manuals, I think it is very important, irrespective of whether an international treaty on autonomous weapons or cyber ever comes to play. This is my second option, actually. What you need to start seeing is national laws or procedures starting to being developed. The U.S. has been pretty transparent in our policy. The U.S. will not be able to be totally transparent because a lot of these documents or directives will be classified. But here's what I got concerned about. Last year, the year before, I was in Moscow. The ICC had a small group conference there about cyber. And small, it was like 30 people in the room, and they were all Russians. And me and my colleague from Brigham Young University, Eric Jensen, were the only Americans. What I got concerned about was not that the Russians were kind of denying that they did cyber operations, which was kind of flies in the face of their public announcements over the years, but they actually asked me whether the U.S. had manuals. And I said, without talking about anything classified, I said, listen, the United States has been very clear that the laws apply. And in the United States practice, when they say that, we sign up to LOAC, we're applying it, that means traditionally, particularly the military, starts developing manuals, right? And most of the specific ones will be classified, but like the Lieber Code and other manuals, those are public. And I said, you should be happy that we have manuals, right? And I said, so can I ask you a question? Do you have manuals? And the Russian official looked at me and said, well, no, because we don't do cyber operations. I said, okay, end of story. But that is important in terms of developing these manuals. And in the international legal community, there are many, many of us around the globe that work together. Like you mentioned, this forum in Geneva, as you start developing that, and like the Tallinn manual did, that's the slow work of making progress, right? And tend to be not very high profile, not sexy, pretty geeky, but that's how it gets to, even if we never have a treaty, that's how you start to get agreement.
David, did you want to add anything, and then we can turn to the ambassador? You should, and then we'll get to the questions. So just quickly, we'll close out on this one.
Sure. I mean, I would say, I think on one hand you have, do we need new law right now, right, in light of the new technology and all the possibilities. On the other hand, can we sort of search back and look at what law exists? And I think that you kind of hear both answers. But I think what I think about is something that Yogi Berra said, which is, it's kind of tough to make predictions, especially about the future. I think we have cases that International Court of Justice has handed down, which can be used, like Nicaragua, to argue on both sides of questions about non-intervention principle. The Corfu Channel is not well understood, but is certainly important for understanding threshold use of force below 2451. So I think you kind of look at these and say, okay, what's available? In 2012, in the first few moments, in terms of getting into these issues, the Obama administration had, then legal advisor of the State Department, Harold Koh, give a speech at U.S. Cyber Command laying out exactly how we think the law of armed conflict, law of war applies to cyber operations, gets into specific effects, and it sort of rests on a physical effect in the real world as a basis for establishing that there's been a use of force. But that's something that a lot of countries, not that many countries have come out and said this. The DoD Law of War Manual, which was released recently, is like 1,200 pages, and it's all publicly available. So these are the kinds of things that I think enable the kind of public debate that the ambassadors discuss, and I think is really important, separate and apart from the internal discussions. But the only other thing I would say is that that what sort of unites these questions about whether the law needs to change or whether we just need to know better what the actual circumstances are is this question about attribution. Because That's not fundamentally a legal question. If you can attribute it to a state, then we know that at least the draft articles of state responsibility apply. We understand what the Geneva Conventions say. And you said bellum, you said bello, but I think the tough thing is knowing whether a state's responsible and then there are consequences in attributing it. And that's a tough call. And in the cyber realm, in the realm of using any of this new technology, we, I think, are mindful of, and I am in advising clients that are in the private sector, that a lot of foreign governments with capabilities don't distinguish between the public and the private sector the way that we do. Mm-hmm. So these are a lot of the sort of challenges that I think relate. But I'm not of the view, as many on the panel are, that the law needs to evolve right now.
The disparity in attribution capabilities is also a significant obstacle in negotiations, in that a few countries, largely those with very powerful SIGINT establishments, can attribute the majority of attacks or cases. But that is a handful of countries, perhaps less than half a dozen. And so when you get the others in the room, they cite attribution as an insurmountable problem. It's not 5 years from now, it will be seen that it's easy to attribute the source of an incident, but currently it's a major obstacle. We had a question in the front, and then I have a question too. Are we going to use, we are, okay, how exciting.
Hi, good morning. My name is Dr. Donna Wells. My question's for the ambassador. I'm a mathematician economist here in Washington. Can we talk about the commodities markets and what regulations systems are in place to regulate price indexes? Recently, they've investigated the price of gold. Thank you.
Did you want to take that one?
I'm sorry, I didn't understand it.
Oh, the question was, do you want to rephrase the question one more time? Oh, sorry. It was about...
Yes, sir. Thank you for your patience. I'm a Georgia Tech trained engineer, so I also know about cyber stuff. This might be a new field, the commodities markets and price indexes. Essentially, a price index, for gold or copper or silver, everything in electronics has copper in it, and so the price index, that's a lot of money. And so, what regulations are in place to make sure that these price indexes are reflective of supply and demand? Is that in place yet, these new systems? Can we talk about that? Thank you.
Sure.
Sorry, I have no knowledge of this field.
Okay, I thought you'd done a little work on some of the economic issues. No? Probably not.
On the price index of gold?
Yeah, no, not on that.
Sorry, that's not my field of...
Well, we'll come back to that one. Give us time to think about it, and then we have one on the side there. Okay. We will get back to you, though.
Hi, I'm Graham Jenkins from EY, and so mine is a little more broadly economic, although also when you're talking about the threshold for attribution and the control over state groups, I wonder if there's any way that political and election law could apply to this. But in terms of the economy, if you start looking at a lot of this series of attacks as indicative of a broader campaign, and one that deals really with economic warfare and kind of economic destabilization, is there still an applicability of armed conflict law there? Does sort of the fact that you're dealing with wholly different aspects of nation-state international relations, does that change the complexion of it? Or do you see this as truly universally applicable, sort of across that realm of relations?
So I think this has come up a couple times. There's an economic element that apparently we didn't touch on since the first two questions are on it, but it's come up in this notion that I'm going to mock it a little bit, that China has a 100-year campaign of economic warfare, and it's death by 1,000 cuts, et cetera, et cetera. And this is an intentional effort to undercut the United States and other Western powers through economic, kind of very slow drip economic warfare. Putting aside whether or not you believe in it, my own feeling generally is if it sounds like a Charlie Chan movie, you should reject it. But I think that's the question, is if you have these long-term economic campaigns, how would that be treated by the laws of armed conflict or international law as we speak on them? And you know what I'm talking about. There's been a couple articles about China's alleged strategy.
Well, let me try, and then you will you will complement. I haven't been following these articles and economic warfare. I think we have to be careful with the terminology we use. Economic warfare is a political term. If you wage war against another country, but with economic means, that may also be, called the competition, a natural competition between countries. What we are talking here is armed conflict, is with the involvement of military forces. It's a bit like the war on terror. The war on terror that was called by the Bush administration is a political term. In our view, it's not a legal term, but the legal term is clearly defined in law, in the use in bello, and the law applicable during armed conflict. And all the other so-called wars, you could have a war on drugs or a war on organized crime. These are political terms that do not follow the laws of war. So for example, how do you regulate price indexes or to make sure that they cannot be abused? That can be regulated by other means, but that would be an entirely different fora. I'm not familiar with the commodity trade. I do not know what would be the right forum. But you could also extend this to other economic areas, like, for example, customs. You can lower your customs in a way that could bring economic problems to another country and then undermine its stability. So you would go to the World Trade Organization to try to address these issues. But we have to be very careful with the term war on something. An economic war, in my view, is not a legal term. It is an important political term, but then we have to find the appropriate form where to deal with it. And most of these issues have to be in the regulatory framework of international trade, for example, that we have to find responsive.
In 1945, those who drafted the UN Charter at the time, they actually made it really clear, because there was a debate among the states, and Latin American states were in one camp. The issue came up. Does economic actions, whether you want to call it sanctions, that was the legal issue. Some people refer to it as warfare and broader. Would that trigger the UN Charter? Meaning, would that constitute a use of force? The answer, which is still the answer, is no. So we know the economic actions, and this comes up on the cyber with China with the IP theft, right? Many other long, boring articles.
I don't know if you were thinking, but I was thinking the rare earth issue as well, where you had manipulations of commodity markets.
And that's where the WTO, there are other international regimes which deal with actions that involve trade and economic relations. But in warfare, right, and you'll notice, like even the UN Charter, I remind my students, the word war is not in the Charter, because that word it's kind of a thing of the past in international law. They talk about use of force, armed attack, laws of armed conflict. It's called laws of armed conflict. It is about conflict, not the economic kind. And that's why I agree with the ambassador. It's a political phrase.
And maybe we should all take a pledge never to use the term act of war again, because that's so imprecise. But go ahead, I didn't mean to interrupt.
I was just going to ask, didn't the new manual now use again the term war?
The new Tallinn manual?
Yeah. No, the new
the DOD
the
manual.
law of war.
They've always used it.
Yeah,
They always use it.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, it was in the context of resort to war, you resort to use of force. But this idea with respect to economic warfare, as it's referred to, I mean, there's certainly an international legal foundation for economic sanctions. You look worldwide, the sanctions that are discussed in the context of the Iran deal. One that has been in the news recently is the UN Security Council Resolution 1929, I think from 2010, question about whether it was violated by the launch of a ballistic missile by Iran in October. I mean, this is something that the UN Security Council, under Chapter 7, Article 41, passed. And so it has international legal standing. It's an obligation. It's not a basis for use of force if someone violates it. But so that's an example of where states like the United States and the EU have imposed domestically or regionally sanctions pursuant to international law. But I do think that the sort of legal basis for that, separate from a UN Security Council resolution, is sort of the same kind of question about thresholds below the use of force. And so the law of countermeasures or retortions or these sorts of things inform that as they would these questions that we've been discussing.
And maybe let me ask Gary if when he response, you could include, and all of you can jump in, a little discussion of the law of countermeasures, which is for actions below the threshold, our yet undefined threshold of the use of force. The law of countermeasures, I think, has just recently been introduced into how international law applies to cyber discussion, but I think it will be a major topic in the future.
Yeah, it's a great topic, and I'll say a little bit about countermeasures. But first, let me, as the military guy on the panel, I guess I'll dumb it down back to the actual law of armed conflict when we talk about cyber. I loved the question because what it brought to my mind was, I don't know if you remember, at one point it was actually controversial that U.S. and allies were bombing oil refineries that were controlled by ISIS to take away some of their economic capacity. So in the context of armed hostilities, taking out economic targets was at one point controversial. We don't hear much about it anymore. I think people decided maybe it was a good idea. But putting that aside, now think of the cyber equivalent of that. So is it okay inside the context of armed hostilities, is it okay to use cyber techniques to recreate something like the flash crash, if you remember that, where hundreds of billions of dollars of value in the stock market disappear in a microsecond because of and that could be done as a cyber attack as opposed to somebody fat fingering, maybe, although really we still don't know exactly what happened for that event, or just hacking into financial systems and making value disappear off the books as opposed to stealing it. Now, I think for the most part we've decided we're going to handle that with law enforcement and domestic law, but inside the context of armed conflict there might be a role for that, and that again points out some of the problems with applying this body of law to cyber techniques. Jim, you're absolutely right. Countermeasures is a really hot topic now partly because there isn't this consensus on how the law of armed conflict applies. So there's a feeling with a lot of the states that are big targets, I think, of cyber hostilities or offenses or whatever you want to call it. I don't want to call them attacks. Something else, cyber nastiness. There's sort of a feeling that we should be able to do something. So we're starting to settle on a consensus, I think, at least in the international legal community, that where somebody does something that violates the law, I can, for lack of a better term, although it's not a good accurate term, I'll say hack back or use electronic measures.
You as the state, not as an individual.
You as the state could hack back. You could actually do other things as well, but it's mostly focused on the cyber response to make it stop, as long as you're proportionate and it's necessary to make it stop.
Is it fair to say it would include sanctions, and that would be part of the?
I think that's easy because that's actually much lower, I think, and would even be like at the retorsion level, which doesn't even require an illegal act in the first place. Oh. The thing that distinguishes countermeasures is the thing that you're doing in response would ordinarily be unlawful, but for the fact that you're doing it as a countermeasure to get the other party to stop doing something unlawful. Boy, it's really illegal sounding, isn't it, when you say it?
Today you say, so one thing I'll disagree with is that there have been some people who've been writing on this for a long time, but it's usually in the international law crowd, right, the academics. But I mean, we're talking about things under the threshold. When you talk about the laws of countermeasures under international law, it's anything, activity that's under the threshold of Article 2.4 of the UN Charter. You know, what is your response? And so like, I mean, my first article, so the norm of non-intervention has now become popular. Well, my first article on cyber and the law of non-intervention was in 2001. I mean, there are people who have been working on it, but the issue on countermeasures is what can you do in response to something, an action that you've suffered as a victim, when it's below the 2.4. So you're not talking about use of force in an armed attack, but you're talking about things like invasion of sovereignty, in the norm of non-intervention. You've had an intervention. The reason why I probably started thinking about it, because I came from the intelligence community, and espionage is below 2.4. So there are things states can do, and they're called countermeasures, but there are specifically defined principles of the law of countermeasure. I do believe policymakers need to pay attention more to the law of countermeasures. But academics, it's been part of the law for many years, and it's very relevant in cyber, as most of these intrusions are below the 2.4. So I think policymakers maybe should just read a little bit up on what the law professors have been saying.
Well,
over the years.
Let me just respond a little bit to that. It's nice that the lawyers have been writing about it. It has not come up in international political discussions until this year. Yeah. So perhaps the discussions have reached the point where its understandings are sufficient to talk about it, but This is the first year I've ever heard
Yeah.
of having done this now for 6 years.
And I think it's the IP theft that really triggered the interest with China. When you saw much of the discussions documenting the damage, at least to the US, from the cyber-enabled IP theft, and that, so I ended up, because of that, wrote a 101-page law review article on what can you do in response to state-sponsored, what I've said, economic espionage. And that's not the company on company or country on company, it's country on foreign company, turn around and give it to your private sector.
99 pages, maybe we would have read it.
No, it's very boring.
101, no.
But you know, I mean, these aren't new concepts, right? The ICJ in the nuclear weapons case examines these basic questions. The word countermeasures has a particular purchase right now, but in the legislation that Congress is debating, that's before the Senate, they use the term defensive measures. It has the same kind of meaning. The word reprisal, which is sort of not in good favor now, is the term that I think was used in some respects. Countermeasures it's a per se illegal act. A retortion, and you can kind of get into this nomenclature, and you start saying, well, I should talk to my lawyer, but the basic concept is, what is a proportionate response? And so when the president said, after the Sony attack, we're going to respond in a proportionate manner in a time and place of our choosing, that's in some way embracing this kind of a concept. It's in the DoD cyber strategy from this year. And so there are basic rules, necessity, proportionality, that apply to whatever your response happens to be. But I don't think that this is a question of needing to make up new law. It's there. It's just you have to read the Nicaragua case, which is well more than 100 pages, and the Corfu Channel case, and look at the oil platforms case. So there's a fair amount of legal guidance there.
Gary or Ambassador, did you want to say anything on this? No? We're getting close to the witching hour, which is good for Halloween. I think we have time for we have three questions. We'll do the three questions. Could I ask perhaps that we ask 1, 2, 3 the questions, and then we'll respond to them so we can keep more or less on track? So we got, hold up your hand if you're going to ask a question. We had that one at 12 o'clock for me, and then one over here at 10 o'clock.
Herbert Regenbogen. I have a question concerning international criminal law in regard to the countermeasure, and specifically to the first chamber of the ICC on this regard, that if there is a criminal act that is a part of intervention in civil war where such countermeasures are being used, doesn't there leave a certain room for discussing this implication of countermeasures in terms of the criminal law issues?
Okay, and we had a question there, and then we have a final question.
Hi, my name is Mike Miglino. My question's for the Colonel, but if you guys also want to weigh in, that's great. So one of the things that cyber does is allows people remotely to engage in a conflict that they maybe would not be able to engage in otherwise, either because that's the expertise they bring to the fight, or maybe they're not willing to lay their life on the line by going, say, to the Middle East and engaging, lifting up an AK-47. Now, when the U.S. military killed Junaid Hussain, who's an ISIS hacker, propagandist, and recruiter, back in August, I guess my question is it allowed somebody, the DoD essentially said, that thing that you were going to support remotely, we'll kill you for that now. We'll come and find you even though you're not actually on the battlefield. So my question is really two parts. One, does that inform the discussion of deterrence in cyberspace? And two, is there an issue of reciprocity at play here where the U.S. military cyber community should now be thinking about how other states might respond to the U.S. DoD, who, say, because of the stand-up of the new Cyber National Mission Forces, are now doing these sorts of cyber operations?
Okay, and then the last question.
Good morning, Major Yado Yakub, United States Marine Corps. And Syria, which is a mess and is only getting messier. You've got the Russians being invited by the recognized government of Syria. You've got Iran getting further entrenched and involved. You've got non-state actors such as Hezbollah or the Kurdish militias. You got the U.S. acting and supporting certain elements, whether clandestinely or a little more openly, and going after ISIS. Has that exposed gaps in public international law, or has it highlighted countering interpretations of public international law? Thank you.
Great. Three great questions to close on. So we had the criminal court one. We had this reciprocity and deterrence, and then we had the implications of Syria. So do we want to just go right down the panel? We'll start with David and go down. Or, well, let's start with you, Ambassador, because you're.
No, I'm fine.
We'll go down the panel and respond to each.
Well, just on the question of Syria, I think that's a terrific question, and it's also, if you look at Syria on one hand and Ukraine on the other. In the case of Syria, under international law, at least the U.S. government position and established sort of principles, in the absence of a UN Security Council authorization under Chapter 7, in the absence of a basis under national or collective self-defense or consent of the government, there's not a basis under international law for using military force there, absent other circumstances. And when you deal with non-state actors, there can be other circumstances. But that's pretty well established. So there's some significant limitations there. And I think but that's a good example of how, notwithstanding those clear lines, the United States has found ways to be involved in trying to achieve its objectives. But there are reciprocity implications, for example, in deciding that there's a fourth basis. For example, the debate about humanitarian intervention cuts into cybersecurity. What if we sort of decide to adopt, because we claim customary international law is a basis for acting in Syria, what then would we say if we're going to use force on the territory of another state, whether through cyber means or through the use of autonomous robots? You can see how suddenly the stability of the international legal system is really in question. And so whenever a decision is made, I think, about whether to stretch the law in that regard, I think a real core question is, well, what are the reciprocity implications of that? And that affects the stability, and that cuts right into deterrence. So I think it's hard to sort of maintain your negative security assurance if you're going to suddenly change the law to fit a particular model, and that's one of the main questions with respect to what Russia seems to be doing in Ukraine.
Okay, Gary?
Sure, and I'll address the question about the hacker. I think there are a couple of different ways the guy could have been a target. I certainly think reciprocity is always a consideration whenever we do policies in any country, and that's one of the reasons why states, I think, have been reluctant to put up their hand and say we did this, because they're concerned about the reciprocal binding of themselves and their own actions to rules, and they're not sure where they want those rules to be. In this case, presumably the United States decided that this guy was either a member of an organized armed group or was directly participating in hostilities, in which case civilians lose their protection from attack in armed conflict. So they must have decided that. As far as the reciprocal, the flip side of that for the U.S., most of the cyber teams that have been put together, most of the members of those are going to be uniformed military folks who are going to be in armed conflict or targets all the time anyway. The civilians, we then have to think about whether or not they were directly participating in hostilities as well. And so you just have to analyze the nature of the action. The question would be, when you're fighting a group like ISIS, obviously, is whether or not the application of law has any meaning for them at all.
I try to answer the one on the ICC. I'm not familiar with the case that you alluded to, but my reaction would be that countermeasures are an instrument that is used by states. It's an instrument of international public law, while in the ICC we address individual criminal responsibility. So the question would be in the ICC whether the fact that something was done as part of a countermeasure can be used as an excuse or as a justification for what has been done. I would have my doubts, but I would have to know the case. At least it's not foreseen in the statute of the ICC to argue that defense. And apart from that, I would be astonished if countermeasures get into the deliberations at the ICC, because it is purely criminal. If you allow me also perhaps to say just a word on the Syria question, because it really is a fascinating question, and it also shows one, and David has alluded to it, one of the structural weaknesses, you could say, of international law, because international law is a moving target, so to speak. It's never set, even though we have Article 2.4 of the United Nations Charter, that should indicate what an armed attack against another country is. You alluded to the responsibility to protect or humanitarian intervention. Humanitarian intervention is an interesting example of how you could develop international law if it is accepted by others. And in Syria, the United States used this unable and unwilling threshold to indicate that they acted as in a case of collective self-defense. The interesting thing, or the interesting question will be whether, because it is a new concept, whether that will be accepted over time. And as you probably certainly know, the Syrian government has now written two letters to the United Nations Security Council indicating that they disagreed with the bombings of some other states. Now, what we will have to see is what influence that will have on the defense or on the explanation of unwilling and unable. But it's an interesting example how you can really develop international law. And I make the point because we mentioned several times the lacuna in international law which we may have to fill. In my view, this is a very different case from the lacunas that we were addressing, because this is a field where you develop international law based on a common consensus. If, for example, after the Kosovo intervention, there had been another humanitarian intervention that would have been widely accepted, we could slowly say as international lawyers, we do have a new standard that would be an exception to Article 2.4. Now that may be the case one day on the unable, unwilling standard, but the lacuna we alluded to are really missing parts of the law. And this is something that we will have to look into to perhaps come to my last sentence. For the new technologies and the challenges we have to face, whether there are really black spots that we cannot develop by law, but that we would really have to, so to speak, legislate to have a common solution for them. Thank you very much.
Commenting on the Syria question, it is a very important case study for not only the development of the norm of humanitarian intervention and whether that will be customary international law one day, but also on the issue of civil and mixed conflict, because that's what you have there, and it is exactly what Nicaragua case was. It was civil and mixed conflict, and we got to remember what the United States lost in that case in the legal argument. The United States argued the self-defense, that they were coming in collective self-defense because other states were propping up the other government. Well, we lost on that argument. So I have less hope on the unwilling and unable because Nicaragua still holds weight in the international community, but here's the challenge for the United States government at least. The United States has been opposed to the development of customary international law on humanitarian intervention, repeatedly. You'll notice even in any intervention you're talking about, the leaders of our country will never use that word. They'll never use that phrase. And there's important reasons, because practice makes custom. And the United States has not been willing, because of the dangers, I think we've mentioned it before, that when you open up that can of worms, we're concerned about what that means. If there is a humanitarian intervention norm, we don't have any agreed criteria for under what circumstances one state could do that. In our view, will be different than another country. So I think the United States is in a difficult position. They won't call it humanitarian intervention, and I know some people won't like this, but because of this area of the law, and because at least the United States position, I do believe, though, when the U.S. when it makes a political decision to help certain groups of people that are not part of the recognized government, then because of where the law is, it ought to do it clandestinely. I mean, I know that's not, a lot of people might not be in favor with that, but it's how you reconcile international law without ripping it apart, right? Or creating a precedent that is dangerous for a lot of people, but while in the same respect, helping people that are suffered. Now, if it does reach a legal threshold of a genocide, and that's where we have, but I do think we lost hope. With Kosovo, everyone was excited, at least the international lawyers were. We saw hope for the new world order, and that humanitarian intervention was going to prevail. And then we have Bosnia and Rwanda. And then what we have to admit as international lawyers, we're not there. And then the United States. I'm not speaking for the United States. I might not have even agreed to it, but they have been very clear that as a policy matter, the norm of humanitarian intervention is not one this country is willing to kind of abide by. And yet the United States will still have a heart and take certain actions to help people in need, right? In Libya as well. So I know that's not positive, but
Well, on that
that's
cheery
positive.
note, Dan, did you have something you wanted to announce? Okay. Well, I think then I'll conclude by doing two things. First, I'll say that I do think that this year saw a change in the nature of international negotiation on the new technologies. And so we're in a different area where there are more participants from the non-Western world, from the global South, whatever you want to call them. And that also a different level on understanding some of the issues that might come up. So there's been a lot of discussion about what is the appropriate fora for this. Is it the Committee on Disarmament? Is it a standing committee? Is it some third body? The default position is probably going to be another GGE, only because everything else is too hard, not because people like it. But all of the topics you've heard here today from this panel are things that I think you can expect to see on the negotiating agenda in the next couple of years. So it's been very helpful for me. Please join me in thanking our panelists.
Thank you.